June 6, 1944. 6:30 hours. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received the first confirmed report of the invasion at his headquarters in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a chateau west of Paris that served as Commander-in-Chief West's operational nerve center. The reports from coastal defense units had been fragmentary for hours. Parachutists landing inland, naval bombardment beginning before dawn, amphibious craft approaching multiple beaches across a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. But fragmentary reports could be deceptions. The Allies had been threatening invasion for months. Every coastal sector reported periodic alerts. This could be another false alarm, another probe, another test of German readiness. Then came the scale, the magnitude that transformed possibility into undeniable reality. 156,000 men came ashore on June 6th. Not thousands, not tens of thousands. The better part of 250,000 soldiers, Americans at Utah and Omaha, British and Canadians at Gold, Juno, and Sword, established themselves on French beaches in coordinated waves that began before dawn and continued through the afternoon. Behind them came 11,000 aircraft, maintaining absolute control of the sky. Supporting them was a naval armada comprising nearly 7,000 ships, the largest assembly of maritime force ever gathered by any nation. And preceding them, dropped during the night in the darkness, came 23,000 airborne troops.
If you found this story valuable, a like helps us share more forgotten chapters of history with those who appreciate them. Subscribe if you'd like to see more. Each story we uncover matters, and your support makes it possible to keep these voices from the past alive.
Including 13,000 American paratroopers who had landed behind German lines, securing bridges, cutting roads, creating chaos in the German rear. Von Rundstedt, studying the situation map as red pins multiplied across the Normandy coastline, understood immediately what this meant. This was not a raid. This was not a limited probe. This was the invasion, the opening of the second front that every German strategist had dreaded since Hitler's armies became bogged down in the Soviet Union. The man receiving this information was not a young officer easily panicked by unexpected developments. Gerd von Rundstedt was 68 years old, the senior field marshal in the entire German Wehrmacht, a professional soldier who had devoted 53 years to military service under 3 different German governments. He had commanded the conquest of Poland in 1939, covering 200 miles in 2 weeks and destroying Polish resistance in 35 days. He had led Army Group A through the Ardennes in 1940, the breakthrough that had made France's collapse inevitable. He had commanded Army Group South in the invasion of the Soviet Union, driving 400 miles through Ukraine in 3 months and conducting one of the largest encirclements in military history, the Kiev Pocket that captured over 500,000 Soviet prisoners. His reputation as one of Germany's finest operational commanders was secure, built on decades of demonstrated competence, careful analysis, and the ability to remain calm when situations deteriorated catastrophically. But von Rundstedt was also a man, shaped by a lifetime of professional military culture that predated the Nazi regime by generations. He came from Prussian aristocracy. His family had produced officers for the Prussian and German states since the 18th century. His grandfather had fought against Napoleon. His father had served as a lieutenant in the Kaiser's army and later rose to general. For the von Rundstedt family, military service was not a career choice. It was an inheritance, a class obligation, an identity inscribed in blood and tradition. Young Gerd had entered the German army as a cadet in March 1892 at the age of 16, stepping into a uniform in the final years of the Kaiser's Reich, in a world where such things still made sense, where duty seemed clear, where the future appeared ordered and predictable. That world had ended long ago. Von Rundstedt had survived the chaos of World War I as a staff officer, learning the mathematics of moving large formations, coordinating artillery and infantry, managing the logistics that determined whether armies advanced or starved. He had watched Germany's defeat in 1918 with the dismay of a professional soldier seeing the culmination of incompetence and madness. He had remained in the small professional Reichswehr that the Versailles Treaty permitted Germany to maintain, rising steadily through ranks that were small but prestigious. By 1932, he commanded a cavalry division. By 1936, he was one of the most senior generals in the German military, a figure of prestige and authority in a nation increasingly dominated by men in brown uniforms who shouted slogans rather than studied military history. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, von Rundstedt was already an established figure, a representative of the old Prussian military aristocracy that predated the Nazi movement by centuries. Among fellow officers, he called Hitler the Bohemian Corporal, a reference to Hitler's modest rank in the Great War and his Austrian origins. Von Rundstedt considered himself a soldier of Germany, not a soldier of any political movement. His loyalty was to the state, to the army, to the traditions of Prussian military service that stretched back generations. Politicians came and went. The army endured. This professional distance allowed von Rundstedt to maintain his aristocratic detachment, even as Nazi ideology consumed German institutions. He never joined the Nazi Party. He never expressed enthusiasm for National Socialist doctrine. But he also never resigned in protest when Germany invaded Poland in violation of the Non-Aggression Pact, signed only months earlier. He simply did his job, and he was brilliant at it. Now, on June 6, 1944, with the invasion confirmed and the map before him filling with enemy positions, von Rundstedt confronted a problem that no amount of professional military skill could solve. The numbers were simply wrong. They had always been wrong, but now the magnitude of their wrongness was becoming undeniable, expressed in hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers pouring onto French beaches. Von Rundstedt had been appointed Commander-in-Chief West in March 1942, with a mission that combined the impossible with the incomprehensible. He was to prepare the defense of the Atlantic coast from Norway to Spain, nearly 3,000 miles of coastline stretching from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. The Allies would eventually invade. This was certain. Every German strategic planner understood it. The question was where and when and whether German forces could defeat the invasion when it came. On paper, von Rundstedt commanded dozens of divisions. In reality, the situation was catastrophically different. Many divisions existed primarily as administrative units rather than fighting formations. Some were understrength, their authorized complement of 15,000 men reduced to perhaps 8,000. Many were undertrained, filled with soldiers who had no business being on a front line. Older conscripts in their 40s who had survived the Eastern Front only through luck. Adolescents who had been pulled from Hitler Youth organizations and given weapons they barely knew how to use. Some divisions consisted primarily of Ostgruppen, soldiers conscripted from the conquered territories of the Soviet Union. Ukrainians, Georgians, Azerbaijanis, men of questionable loyalty serving in a German army whose ideology classified them as subhuman. The quality of German equipment varied wildly. Some units still employed obsolete weapons from the 1920s. Tank divisions were frequently below authorized strength. One panzer division von Rundstedt inspected personally in early 1944 was authorized 170 tanks. It possessed 37. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe. German fighter production, hampered by Allied bombing of aircraft factories and fuel production facilities, could not keep pace with losses. American and British bombers struck German industry by day and by night. German fighter forces attempting to stop them were being ground down in a battle of attrition that Germany could not win. The Kriegsmarine had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats still sailed, but they were being sunk faster than they could be built, and the convoy routes bringing American men and material to Britain flowed with the security of uncontested seas. Most critically, Germany faced a resource problem that could not be solved by tactical brilliance or operational skill. Von Rundstedt was being asked to defend an entire continent against enemies who controlled the seas and the sky, with an army that was already bleeding to death in the east, with no prospect of reinforcement and no margin for error whatsoever. The mathematics were simple, and they were catastrophic. Germany did not have enough men to defend everywhere. Germany did not have enough tanks or aircraft or fuel to contest the skies or the seas. Every division stationed in the West was a division not fighting in the East, where the Soviet Union was demonstrating that it could absorb losses of millions and still produce more soldiers, still advance, still fight. The fundamental problem that had occupied von Rundstedt's thinking since March 1942 was strategic, not tactical. How could Germany defend a 3,000-mile coastline against an enemy who could choose where to attack, when to attack, and with what strength? The Allies possessed complete freedom of maneuver. Germany possessed none. The Allies could concentrate overwhelming force at any point they selected. Germany had to be strong everywhere, and was therefore weak everywhere. This contradiction had driven the strategic debate that had consumed the German High Command for 18 months. The argument pitted von Rundstedt against Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been appointed to command Army Group B, the forces stationed in Normandy, Brittany, and the approaches to Calais, in November 1943. Von Rundstedt's strategic philosophy was rooted in classical military doctrine. You cannot be strong everywhere, therefore you do not try. You accept risk in secondary sectors. You concentrate your strength at the decisive point. You wait until the enemy commits himself. Then you mass your reserves and counterattack. The Panzer divisions, Germany's only mobile reserve, the only forces capable of rapid maneuver, should be positioned well back from the coast, perhaps 100 miles inland, preserved for mobile operations. When the Allies landed, when their location became certain, when they began to consolidate their beachheads, then the Panzer reserves would strike. They would drive rapidly to the coast, smashing into the enemy while he was still disorganized, still establishing defensive positions, still vulnerable to a concentrated counterattack delivered at the moment of maximum surprise. Rommel had fought the British and Americans in North Africa. He had seen what happened to German armor when it faced superior air power. He had watched his supply convoys burn on the desert roads to Tobruk. He had seen his tanks destroyed by fighter bombers before they could reach the battlefield. He had experienced the devastating effects of naval gunfire on coastal positions. Rommel believed that once the Allies established themselves ashore, German armor would never reach the coast. Allied fighter bombers would destroy the panzers on the roads as they moved forward. Allied naval guns would shatter any counterattack that approached the beaches. The beaches themselves would become killing grounds for German infantry who tried to defend them against enemy forces with complete air superiority and overwhelming firepower. Rommel argued for a fundamentally different strategy. Every tank, every gun, every soldier had to be positioned as close to the water as possible. The invasion had to be stopped at the waterline in the first hours after the landing. Once the Allies had consolidated their position, once they had brought in reinforcements and supplies, once they had established defensive positions and accumulated reserves, they could never be dislodged. The only chance for success was to defeat the invasion on the beaches before the Allies could consolidate. Rommel had famously told his staff that the first 24 hours would be decisive. It would be the longest day. And on that day, the outcome of the war in the West would be determined. Both men had valid points. Von Rundstedt's classical approach had worked throughout military history. Rommel's assessment of Allied air and naval power was accurate. A compromise might have worked better than either approach adopted exclusively. But Hitler characteristically chose the worst possible option. He compromised by keeping direct control of the key panzer divisions himself. The Panzer Lehr Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division could not move without Hitler's personal authorization. This decision, made in Berlin by a man who had never commanded troops in combat and who refused to visit the front, removed strategic flexibility from the commanders who could actually see what was happening. What it meant, in practical terms, was delay. It meant that when the invasion came, The men who understood the situation would have to ask permission from a man 1,000 miles away who understood nothing at all. It meant that the critical hours after the landing would be consumed requesting authorization rather than executing operations. It meant that the window for effective response would close before the response could begin. Von Rundstedt requested the release of the Panzer reserves immediately upon confirmation of the invasion. The 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr were positioned to counterattack if authorization came quickly. Every hour of delay allowed the Allies to strengthen their beachheads. Every hour was measurable in lives and in strategic advantage. The request went to Hitler's headquarters at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, where the Führer had been staying since late spring. What happened next would become one of the most analyzed moments of the Second World War, a sequence of decisions that lasted only hours, but whose consequences extended for 10 months and determined the course of the war in the West. Hitler had stayed awake until 2 or 3 in the morning on the night of June 5th, watching newsreels with his close circle, including Joseph Goebbels and Eva Braun. His personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, had administered the chemical cocktail that Hitler relied upon for sleep, a mixture of stimulants and sedatives whose exact composition remains debated by historians, but which clearly included substances that left him dependent and frequently disoriented. In the early morning hours of June 6th, as paratroopers were landing in Normandy and naval bombardment was beginning, Hitler had finally taken a sleeping pill. His staff, terrified of his rages, refused to wake him. The Führer had left explicit orders not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Even Albert Speer, the armaments minister, who arrived at the Berghof around 10 in the morning and immediately grasped the magnitude of what was happening, found Hitler still asleep. The panzer divisions sat motionless, their engines cold, their crews waiting for orders that did not come. Hours passed. The Allies consolidated their positions. More men came ashore. More equipment landed on the beaches. More supplies accumulated. The window for a decisive counterattack was closing with every passing hour. Hitler finally woke around noon. Even then, he did not immediately authorize the panzer movement. He was convinced that Normandy was a deception, a diversionary attack designed to draw German reserves away from the real invasion site at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, only 21 miles from the British coast. Allied deception operations, code-named Fortitude, had created an entire Phantom Army group in southeast England under the command of General George S. Patton, Jr. German intelligence, intercepting radio traffic that the Allies had deliberately leaked, had been convinced for months that Patton commanded over 1 million troops waiting to strike at Calais. The deception was extraordinarily sophisticated and extraordinarily effective. German spy networks, some of which were actually under British control, confirmed the presence of this phantom force. German signal intelligence reported radio communications from non-existent units. German analysis concluded that Calais remained the most likely invasion target. Hitler refused to release the panzer reserves until he was certain that Normandy was the main invasion and not a feint. He kept them in place, waiting for an attack on Calais that would never come. The deception operation that had been designed to confuse German tactical commanders had achieved something far more consequential. It had paralyzed Germany's strategic response at the moment when response mattered most. By the time the panzer divisions finally received authorization to move, it was late afternoon, nearly 12 hours after the invasion had begun. The window had closed. What should have been a rapid deployment to the coast became a grinding ordeal against unprecedented opposition. Allied aircraft were waiting. Columns of tanks and trucks moving on French roads in daylight were easy targets for fighter bombers. The Jabos, the German pilots' term for fighter bombers, struck again and again. The 21st Panzer Division, the only German armored unit close enough to attempt a counterattack on D-Day itself, launched a disjointed attack that evening. One battle group actually reached the coast between the British beaches, temporarily penetrating the gap between the landing zones. But the force was too weak to exploit the penetration. By nightfall, it had withdrawn after losing 70 of its 124 tanks. The moment to throw the Allies back into the sea had passed. It would never return. Von Rundstedt watched this unfold with growing despair that he could barely conceal from his staff. Every hour that passed allowed the Allies to land more men, more tanks, more artillery. Every hour allowed them to strengthen defensive positions and bring forward additional supplies. Every hour reduced Germany's chances of victory, and there was nothing he could do about it. The decisions were being made in Bavaria by a man who had never commanded troops in combat, who refused to visit the front, who relied on colored pins on a map to understand situations that could only be grasped by seeing them firsthand. The first week after D-Day confirmed von Rundstedt's worst fears. The Allies were not going to be pushed back into the sea. They were establishing themselves, building up their forces, preparing to break out into the French interior. German counterattacks failed one after another. The 12th SS Panzer Division, when it finally arrived, launched attacks that caused heavy Allied casualties but failed to dislodge the beachhead. Every panzer division fed into the fighting was beginning to suffer losses it could never replace. The first week of the Normandy campaign consumed German reserves in a pattern that von Rundstedt had anticipated and Rommel had feared. The 12th SS Panzer Division arrived in the Normandy sector on June 7th, delayed by Allied air attacks on the roads from Belgium that had forced the division to make numerous detours, consuming fuel and losing time. When it finally engaged Allied forces near Caen, the division launched repeated attacks against British positions that inflicted heavy casualties but failed to achieve breakthrough. More critically, each attack consumed tanks and trained crews that Germany could never replace. The mathematics of replacement were catastrophic. Germany's tank production in June 1944 averaged approximately 1,600 tanks per month across all types: the Panzer IV, the newer Panther, the Tiger Hammern, and various assault guns and tank destroyers. But German tank losses in France alone were running at rates that approached 500 to 800 tanks monthly. Worse, the losses were concentrated among veteran units whose crew experience represented decades of training and combat accumulation. A tank could be replaced in a factory. A trained panzer crew required years to develop the coordination and instinctive understanding that separated competent armor operations from catastrophic failure. Those crews were being killed at unsustainable rates, and there were no replacements in the pipeline. Panzer Lehr, the newest and best-equipped panzer division in the German order of battle, arrived in the Normandy sector on June 10th. Its journey from its assembly areas near Chartres had taken 4 days, a distance of less than 60 miles. The delay was entirely due to Allied air attacks. The division had been attacked repeatedly on the roads during daylight hours by RAF Typhoons and American P-47 Thunderbolts, those aircraft with their 8 machine guns and rockets proving devastatingly effective against vehicles moving on narrow French roads with no air cover. When Panzer Lehr finally arrived in the combat zone, it had lost approximately 50 tanks and assault guns, not to enemy armor, not to anti-tank fire, but to air attack during movement to the front. By June 17th, 11 days after the invasion, the situation map in von Rundstedt's headquarters told a story of deteriorating German prospects, expressed in red symbols marking destroyed formations and blue symbols marking expanding enemy positions. The Allies had consolidated their beachheads. The American 4th Infantry Division, which had landed at Utah Beach on June 6th, with relatively light casualties, approximately 197 killed and wounded, had pushed inland and linked up with the American 101st Airborne Division that had jumped behind the lines. The British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword were grinding toward Caen, the objective that General Bernard Montgomery had hoped to capture on D-Day itself, but which remained in German hands 3 weeks later. held by determined defenders but consuming German resources in static defensive fighting that the Wehrmacht could not afford. Most critically, American forces were rapidly approaching Cherbourg, the deep-water port that Hitler had ordered, held at all costs. The strategic importance was obvious. As long as the Allies were restricted to the limited beach resources, mulberry harbors that were elaborate artificial harbor constructions towed across the channel, their supply rate would be constrained. But once they captured a major port with existing infrastructure, they could begin unloading supplies at the rate American logistics could deliver them. The port of Cherbourg, with its capacity to handle tens of thousands of tons daily, would transform the invasion from a tenuous beachhead to a consolidated invasion base that Germany could never dislodge. Reinforcements were not arriving as scheduled. Divisions that should have reached Normandy within a week of the invasion were still en route weeks later, delayed by damaged railways, blocked roads, and the continuous toll of Allied air attacks. The French resistance, coordinated with Allied intelligence, was actively sabotaging the rail network. Telephone lines were cut, preventing rapid communication between German headquarters. Convoys were ambushed. Bridges were destroyed. The German army in Normandy was slowly being isolated from its sources of reinforcement and supply. On June 17th, von Rundstedt and Rommel traveled to the Berghof to meet with Hitler. The journey itself, from Normandy to the Bavarian Alps, consumed most of a day. They had requested a meeting with Hitler weeks earlier, but the Führer had been reluctant to meet with his commanders, preferring to conduct the war through telephone calls and written reports. Only the deteriorating situation forced him to agree. The fact that the senior field marshals had to travel 1,000 miles to speak with their commander-in-chief about an ongoing battle on the scale of Normandy said everything about the dysfunction of German command arrangements. The Berghof sat on a mountainside near Berchtesgaden, Hitler's retreat since the 1920s, a compound of buildings designed for comfort and security rather than military headquarters. When von Rundstedt and Rommel arrived, they found Hitler in a condition that alarmed both officers. He appeared pale and exhausted. His hands trembled visibly. He walked with a stoop, his famous energy transformed into a nervous agitation that alarmed the officers who saw him. He moved slowly, as if the effort of walking itself had become difficult. His eyes seemed unfocused. Post-war medical analysis would suggest he was suffering from Parkinson's disease, though at the time the symptoms were attributed to stress and the relentless pressure of conducting a war that was slipping beyond his control. His personal physician, Dr. Morel, attended him constantly, administering injections of stimulants that left him more agitated than energized. Rommel spoke first, abandoning diplomatic language in favor of brutal clarity. The situation in Normandy was worse than Berlin understood. The front was barely holding. Casualties were running at approximately 2,500 men per day, killed, wounded, or missing. Replacements were arriving at perhaps 1,000 men daily. The deficit of 2,500 men per day meant that German strength was declining day after day, week after week, with no prospect of reversal. More critically, the Allies had complete air superiority. German soldiers could not move during daylight without being attacked from the air. Convoys could not be resupplied. Reinforcements could not be moved forward. Tank concentrations could not be established because concentrations of armor were exactly what Allied fighter bombers were designed to destroy. Rommel presented numbers that painted a strategic picture of inevitability. The Allies were landing approximately 20,000 tons of supplies daily through the mulberry harbors and by beach landing craft. That figure would increase when they captured Cherbourg. German supply capacity was approximately 7,000 tons daily when the roads were secure, which they increasingly were not. The disparity meant that every day, the Allies were gaining an absolute advantage in men, equipment, and supplies that would only accelerate as their logistics network matured. The mathematics of the situation were undeniable. Unless something changed dramatically, unless Germany could achieve air parity, unless reinforcements arrived in massive numbers, unless a way was found to stop the Allied logistical buildup, the front would eventually collapse. Rommel urged Hitler to consider the political implications of continued resistance without prospect of military victory. Perhaps, Rommel suggested, with the careful language of a man proposing the unthinkable to a man with absolute power, negotiations might be worth considering. Perhaps the Reich could preserve some portion of Germany's position before total collapse made any negotiation impossible. Perhaps there were political solutions to situations that had become military impossibilities. The suggestion hung in the air like poison gas. Hitler's response was immediate and volcanic. He accused Rommel of defeatism, of lacking faith in the German people, of failing to understand the true nature of the situation. He spoke of new weapons that would turn the tide. The V-1 flying bomb had just begun hitting London. German intelligence had reported successful attacks on the British capital. V-2 rockets would follow within months. Jet fighters equipped with revolutionary technology would sweep the Allied bombers from the sky. Germany's scientists and engineers were working on weapons beyond the comprehension of conventional military thought. These wonder weapons would change everything. More fundamentally, Hitler insisted that will could overcome material disadvantage. German soldiers, fighting for their homeland, for their families, for the future of the Reich, would accomplish miracles that enemy calculations said were impossible. He had turned around seemingly hopeless situations before through determination and faith. He would do so again. The Allies had superior numbers and superior air power, true, but Germany possessed superior will, superior courage, superior dedication to victory. The outcome would be determined not by mathematics, but by the strength of belief. He ordered Cherbourg held at all costs. No retreat. No surrender. The city would be held until the last man died defending it. The same applied to every position in Normandy. Every mile of territory would be contested. Every inch would cost the enemy blood. German soldiers would fight with the ferocity that the Führer demanded, and victory would be achieved through the sheer force of German superiority expressed in combat. The conference descended into chaos when a V-1 flying bomb, one of Hitler's wonder weapons that was supposed to devastate England, fell near the Berghof, apparently from a German supply convoy that had been carrying the weapons northward. The impact sent everyone scrambling for cover, a moment of physical danger that seemed to embody the surreal nature of German strategy, putting hope in weapons that worked so poorly that one had nearly killed the Führer himself at his own headquarters. Von Rundstedt said little during the conference. He had learned through months of interaction with Hitler that arguing with him was pointless. The Führer did not respond to reasoned analysis. He responded to his own intuitions, his own ideological convictions, his own absolute certainty that he understood war better than the professionals who had studied it their entire lives. The man who had once made bold, aggressive gambles based on accurate assessment of enemy weakness was now clinging to fantasies about miracle weapons and the transformative power of unshakable determination. The man who had conquered Poland, France, and vast territories of the Soviet Union through brilliant operational art was now trapped in a command structure that refused to acknowledge reality. Von Rundstedt later assessed that the discussion had no success whatsoever. The only thing accomplished was the confirmation of what the field marshals already knew, that Hitler would not permit any strategic change, that he would not authorize retreats or consolidations, that he would not consider the possibility that the war could not be won by military means. The orders remained unchanged. Hold everywhere, counterattack when possible, wait for the wonder weapons, have faith in German superiority. Faith would overcome arithmetic, will would conquer mathematics, belief would substitute for tanks, aircraft, and industrial capacity. Von Rundstedt and Rommel flew back to France knowing they had failed to change anything, They had presented facts. They had explained the situation. They had been dismissed. They had spoken plainly to a man who could not hear plain speech because it contradicted his own certainty about how events should unfold. The situation deteriorated with acceleration that seemed to follow the laws of physics rather than military strategy. On June 18th, American forces under General J. Lawton Collins cut off the Cotentin Peninsula from the rest of France, isolating Cherbourg with its vital port facilities. The fortress garrison, under the command of German General Wilhelm von Schlieben, was ordered to hold to the last man. The American 4th, 9th, and 79th Infantry Divisions surrounded the city, bringing artillery into position, establishing siege lines, preparing for systematic reduction. Von Schlieben, recognizing the hopelessness of his position but understanding his orders, prepared his soldiers to defend a city that could not be relieved, in a battle that had already been lost strategically before it began tactically. The German garrison numbered approximately 4,000 combat troops, plus another 1,000 administrative and support personnel, all knowing that German reinforcements could not possibly reach them, that their position was untenable, but that their orders were to fight until death. For 3 days, from June 24th through June 26th, German soldiers defended Cherbourg's fortifications against American artillery, aircraft, and infantry attacks. The fighting was desperate and futile. On June 26th, von Schlieben surrendered. The fortress garrison fell back to the harbor fortifications, which continued fighting until June 29th before finally capitulating. The cost to Germany was approximately 400 casualties plus 4,000 prisoners of war. The cost to the Allies was approximately 800 American casualties. But the strategic consequence dwarfed these tactical numbers. Within weeks, American engineers had the port of Cherbourg partially operational. Within months, it would be handling approximately 14,000 tons of supplies per day. The Allies would never be constrained by beach resources again. German strategy had lost its mathematical foundation. Meanwhile, the British were grinding toward Caen, the key city that General Bernard Montgomery commanded at the 21st Army Group had hoped to capture on D-Day itself. 3 weeks after the invasion, Caen was still in German hands, but the battle for it was consuming the German armored reserve at an unsustainable rate. Operation Epsom, launched by the British on June 26th, pushed forward with the intention of encircling Caen from the west. The British 1st and 2nd Armies advanced to within 2 miles of the city before being halted by desperate German resistance. But halting the British offensive cost Germany tanks and trained crews it could never replace. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, the 2 SS Panzer Corps, and various other panzer units were fed into the fighting around Caen in a static defensive battle where armor was stripped of mobility and reduced to pillbox functions. Defended positions that could be shelled by artillery, attacked by aircraft, and eventually overrun by infantry. Every day, dozens of tanks were destroyed. Every day, veteran crews who had taken years to develop expertise were killed or wounded. The German army in the West was bleeding to death, holding ground that would eventually be lost anyway. The pattern was becoming mathematically predictable. Germany would fight for every town, every village, every road junction. Germany would suffer casualties it could not replace. Germany would lose equipment it could not replace. And Germany would ultimately be defeated, with the only variable being how much destruction would occur before the inevitable conclusion became undeniable. On June 29th, von Rundstedt and Rommel met with Hitler again, this time at the Berghof. They flew from France to Germany, consuming hours in travel, leaving the crumbling front in the hands of subordinates. The fact that the senior field marshals commanding the Western Front had to make a 1,000-mile journey to brief the commander-in-chief about an ongoing major campaign said everything about how completely the German command system had become detached from military reality. This meeting was shorter and more bitter than the June 17th conference. Rommel, abandoning any remaining diplomatic language, presented the situation with bluntness that approached insubordination. The front cannot hold indefinitely. The troops are fighting bravely, but they cannot fight tanks with rifles. They cannot stop aircraft with machine guns. Every day we lose ground we cannot retake. The Allies grow stronger while we grow weaker. The only question is whether we lose the war slowly or quickly. Whether we spend our entire army holding worthless territory or preserve it for a defense that might actually succeed. He presented the numbers again, updated with the latest intelligence. Ally supplies arriving daily had now exceeded 25,000 tons. German supply capacity remained approximately 7,000 tons daily. The deficit was accelerating. German manpower losses were approaching 50,000 since D-Day. German replacements totaled approximately 15,000. For every German soldier lost, no replacement arrived. The arithmetic was inexorable. Hitler responded with the same arguments he had offered on June 17th. New divisions would arrive. Wonder weapons would devastate the enemy. The alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union would collapse from its internal contradictions. The Western democracies would lose their will to fight when casualties mounted. Germany only needed to hold on until the tide turned. The Führer was certain. He had seen it before. German will would overcome Allied material advantage. Von Rundstedt, who had remained silent during the June 17th meeting, finally spoke. He had listened to these arguments for months as the situation deteriorated. He had watched them fail to correspond with reality as the front had collapsed. He was 68 years old, tired, and burdened by the knowledge that good soldiers were dying in battles that could not be won for objectives that could not be achieved. He was a professional soldier who had spent his entire life studying war, mastering its complexities, understanding its mathematics. He was tired of polite professional discourse that changed nothing, while reality moved in a direction that rendered such discourse irrelevant. "The war in the West is lost," von Rundstedt said. The words hung in the room like a declaration of treason. Not losing, not deteriorating, not becoming difficult, but lost, past tense, complete. The question, von Rundstedt continued, was not whether Germany would be defeated, but when and at what cost. Every day the war continued. More German soldiers died for nothing. Every day brought more destruction to German cities. Every day reduced the territory that remained to save. The only rational course, the only course that a commander genuinely concerned with the welfare of his soldiers and his nation could follow, was to seek an end to the fighting before Germany was utterly destroyed, before there was nothing left to save, before the complete collapse of German society made recovery impossible for generations. Hitler stared at him. The room fell silent. Other officers in the room looked at the floor, unwilling to be visibly associated with such dangerous candor. To suggest that Germany should seek peace was to suggest that Hitler had failed. To suggest that the war could not be won was to contradict the Führer's absolute certainty. To suggest that continued fighting was irrational was to challenge Hitler's authority and judgment. Hitler's response began quietly. He stared at von Rundstedt with an intensity that made several officers physically uncomfortable. Then he began to speak, his voice rising in volume and fury. He accused von Rundstedt of cowardice, of betraying the German people and the soldiers fighting at the front, of lacking faith in the greatness of the German nation. He insisted that victory was still possible if only the generals would believe in it, if only they would fight with the determination that he demanded. The generals had lost their nerve. They had allowed themselves to be intimidated by superior numbers. They lacked the will to overcome obstacles that appeared insurmountable only because they lacked faith. The meeting ended without resolution. Nothing had changed. Nothing would change. Von Rundstedt and Rommel flew back to France knowing that they had spoken the truth and been rejected for speaking it. Worse, they knew that their honesty had marked them as unreliable in the eyes of the man who held absolute power over their fates. 2 days later came the telephone call that would define the moment. It was July 1st, 1944. The immediate trigger was a series of reversals that had accumulated over the previous 48 hours. American forces had broken through German defensive positions around Saint-Lô. The situation around Cherbourg had become completely untenable. German defensive positions were collapsing. And on July 1st, at the German High Command headquarters in East Prussia, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the High Command Staff, Hitler's primary military advisor, and the officer who bore responsibility for transmitting Hitler's orders to the field commanders, wanted to know what von Rundstedt recommended be done to stabilize the front. Keitel called von Rundstedt's headquarters in the late afternoon. The conversation was brief and would become legendary in German military history. Von Rundstedt had no patience left for the charade. He had been warning for weeks. He had been ignored for weeks. He had watched good soldiers die for weeks in a cause that was already lost. He had traveled to the Berghof and spoken plainly. He had been dismissed. Now, days later, he was being asked what should be done as if the previous conversations had never occurred. When Keitel asked what should be done to stabilize the situation, what should be done to restore German defensive capability, von Rundstedt answered with the only honest response remaining. His words were not diplomatic. They were not couched in the careful language that generals used when addressing the Supreme Command. They were not softened with qualifications or hedged with alternative interpretations. They were blunt, direct, and devastating. "End the war, you idiots! What else can you do?" The line went silent. Keitel said nothing. There was nothing to say. Von Rundstedt had spoken the truth that everyone in the German High Command knew, but no one dared articulate outside the privacy of their own thoughts. The war was lost. Continuing to fight would only determine how much additional destruction would occur before the inevitable surrender. The only rational course was to seek peace while there was still something left to negotiate, before Germany was completely destroyed, before the situation became so catastrophic that negotiation became impossible. The words would cost von Rundstedt his command. Within 24 hours, Hitler issued dismissal orders. The official announcement attributed his departure to age and ill health. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, recently arrived from the Eastern Front, was appointed to replace him as Commander-in-Chief West. Von Rundstedt was told to go home and await further orders. There was no court-martial, no public disgrace, no dramatic confrontation. Hitler still needed the appearance of support from the old Prussian military aristocracy. But von Rundstedt's active career appeared to be over. He had spoken the truth, and truth was not tolerated in Hitler's Germany. What happened in the months following von Rundstedt's dismissal proved every word he had spoken to be accurate. The war that von Rundstedt had said was lost on July 1st, 1944 would continue for another 10 months. Millions more would die. German cities would be reduced to rubble. The Red Army would fight its way to Berlin, exacting a terrible revenge for the horrors Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union. And the man who had seen the end coming, who had spoken it plainly, who had been removed for his honesty, would watch from retirement as everything he predicted came to pass, exactly as he had foreseen. Von Kluge, von Rundstedt's replacement, arrived in France confident that he could succeed where von Rundstedt had failed. He had commanded successfully on the Eastern Front. He believed the situation in the West could be stabilized if it was handled properly, if new tactics were employed, if will and determination were applied with sufficient intensity. Within days, he understood the reality. The situation was exactly as bad as von Rundstedt had described, perhaps worse. The Allies were not going to be stopped. They were establishing themselves, building up their forces, preparing to break out into the French interior. Von Kluge would eventually come to the same conclusion that von Rundstedt had reached and spoken aloud, that the war was lost. But by then, the opportunity to speak that truth had passed. On July 20, 1944, less than 3 weeks after von Rundstedt's dismissal, a group of German military officers and civilians attempted to assassinate Hitler and seize control of the German state. The plot, codenamed Operation Valkyrie, represented the convergence of months of planning and multiple attempts to remove Hitler and create a government that could negotiate peace before Germany was completely destroyed. The conspirators included General Ludwig Beck, former chief of the General Staff who had opposed Hitler's war plans since 1938, Karl Goerdeler, a German civilian politician and economist, Fabian von Schlabrendorf, a staff officer who had attempted to kill Hitler with a bomb placed in a wine bottle, and Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a staff officer with one eye and 3 fingers on one hand, the result of wounds suffered in North Africa, who had come to believe that killing Hitler was a moral imperative. Stauffenberg had access to Hitler's inner circle through his position as chief of staff to the commander of the Home Army. On July 20th, he attended a briefing at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortified headquarters complex, hidden in the forests of East Prussia, 800 miles from the front lines. He carried a briefcase containing a British bomb, 2 kilograms of plastic explosives fitted with a time-delayed detonator. As the briefing progressed in the map room, Stauffenberg excused himself, found a nearby bathroom, and armed the explosive device. He returned to the conference room and placed the briefcase under the oak table, positioned a few feet from where Hitler stood, studying the situation map. At 12:42 in the afternoon, the bomb detonated. The explosion was powerful enough to destroy the entire room and kill everyone within 15 feet of the blast. 4 officers died immediately. 8 more were wounded, but Hitler survived. A heavy oak table, reinforced for its function as a map table for a commander-in-chief, had shielded him from the worst of the blast. He emerged with ruptured eardrums, burns on his legs and hands, wounds from wooden splinters, his hair and uniform singed, but very much alive. The conspiracy collapsed within hours. The conspirators had assumed Hitler was dead and began implementing their plan to seize power. When news came that Hitler had survived, the entire operation fell apart. The coup d'état that was supposed to save Germany from complete destruction collapsed because a table stood between Hitler and death by a distance measured in centimeters. Stauffenberg, realizing the situation was lost, returned to his headquarters in Berlin. He attempted to call General Friedrich Fromm, the commander of the Home Army, to order troops to arrest Nazi officials and seize control of the government. But Fromm, uncertain and afraid, refused to commit. By evening, the situation had become clear. The coup had failed. Stauffenberg and 3 fellow conspirators were taken to the courtyard of the Bendler Block, the Home Army headquarters in Berlin. Shortly after midnight, they were executed by firing squad. Stauffenberg's last words, spoken as bullets struck him, were "Long live sacred Germany," a final invocation of a nation he believed was being destroyed by the man he had attempted to kill. Rommel, the field marshal who had urged Hitler to seek peace, was implicated in the conspiracy. He had known about the plot and had not reported it to Hitler. Some evidence suggested he had been more actively involved, though he denied this under interrogation. The evidence against him was strong enough that Hitler could not ignore it, but Rommel was too popular to put on trial. His victories in North Africa had made him a national hero. A public trial would reveal that Germany's most famous general had turned against the regime. Such a trial would undermine confidence in the Nazi state at a moment when the regime's grip on power was being challenged by military officers and civilians who had concluded that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. Rommel was offered a choice by 2 generals, Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Meisel, who arrived at his home in Herrlingen with a vial of cyanide. He could face the People's Court, Hitler's kangaroo court, where conviction and execution were certain and where his family would face persecution afterward, or he could take poison and die as a hero. The state would announce that he had died of his wounds from a strafing attack on his staff car in July. He would receive a state funeral with full military honors. His family would be protected. His reputation would be preserved. Rommel understood the choice. On October 14, 1944, he told his wife Lucy and his son Manfred what was about to happen. He said goodbye to them. He walked to the waiting car and swallowed the cyanide capsule. He was 52 years old. The man who had understood the situation in Normandy better than almost anyone, who had urged Hitler to seek peace while there was still something to negotiate, was dead because he had been right. Von Kluge fared no better. In early August, American forces under General Omar Bradley executed Operation Cobra, a breakout from the Normandy beachhead designed to penetrate German lines and pour into the French interior. The operation punched through German defensive positions around Saint-Lô with a force that German reserves could not contain. The breakthrough created opportunities that American commanders exploited with speed and flexibility. General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding the Third Army, drove through the gap and wheeled toward Brittany and toward the interior of France. The German front, stretched thin, began to crack under pressure it could not resist. Von Kluge ordered a counterattack at Mortain that Hitler had demanded, even though von Kluge knew it was hopeless. The terrain around Mortain was difficult, hilly, forested, unsuitable for the mobile operations that the German counterattack required. The forces available were insufficient for the objective assigned. The counterattack had no reasonable prospect of success, but Hitler had demanded it, and von Kluge obeyed. The counterattack failed, as von Kluge had known it would. Worse, the concentration of German forces around Mortain for the counterattack created an opportunity that American and British commanders immediately recognized. German forces were being compressed into a pocket. American forces driving from the south could link up with Canadian and British forces driving from the north, encircling German armies so that would have no escape route. The Falaise Pocket, as it would become known, formed in early August. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped in an area measuring perhaps 40 kilometers across. The perimeter was collapsing. The exits were closing. Escape routes that had existed on August 10th were sealed by August 15th. The German 7th Army and parts of the 5th Panzer Army were being systematically destroyed. The Allies, having achieved their tactical breakthrough, were now in position to achieve something more significant: the complete destruction of German military capability in France. The pocket took 7 days to close completely. The fighting within it was desperate and chaotic. German soldiers attempted to break out in multiple directions. Allied aircraft attacked concentrations of troops and vehicles. Artillery shelled the roads and fields. Tanks and anti-tank guns fought at close range in the confusion of a collapsing front. When it was finally over, between 10,000 and 15,000 German soldiers had been killed. Another 40,000 to 50,000 had been captured. Thousands more had escaped, but they had escaped without their vehicles, their weapons, their heavy equipment. The German 7th Army ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The armor reserves that von Rundstedt had wanted to preserve for mobile operations had been squandered in static defensive fighting and then destroyed in a pocket that should never have formed if the front had been permitted to withdraw to defensible positions. The mathematics of Falaise were expressed in destroyed equipment that represented irreplaceable industrial capacity. Approximately 500 German tanks and assault guns were destroyed in the pocket, tanks that Germany could not replace. Tank production in August 1944 was approximately 1,800 units across all types, but German tank losses in France in August alone exceeded 2,000. The arithmetic was unsustainable. For every tank Germany produced, more than one tank was destroyed. The reserves were being consumed. The pool of replacements was being exhausted. Von Kluge, recognizing the catastrophe, wrote a letter to Hitler acknowledging the disaster and urging him to recognize that the war in the West was lost. The letter also contained suggestions, carefully worded, that peace should be considered before the complete destruction of Germany made any negotiation impossible. He recommended withdrawal from France, consolidation of forces, and a transition to defensive operations that might preserve something of German territory and population. Hitler's response was fury. He suspected von Kluge of attempting to negotiate with the Allies, of preparing to surrender forces without authorization, of losing his nerve and his faith. Von Kluge was recalled to Berlin. On August 19, 1944, on the road back to Germany near Metz, von Kluge pulled his car to the side of the road and swallowed cyanide. He was 61 years old. He left a letter to Hitler urging him to show the greatness that the situation required, to recognize the inevitability of defeat and to seek an end to the fighting before Germany was utterly destroyed. The pattern was unmistakable. Every senior commander who saw the truth and spoke it was destroyed. Rommel, the hero of North Africa, dead by poison because he understood that the war could not be won. Von Kluge, brought in to stabilize the situation, dead by poison because he reached the same conclusion that von Rundstedt had reached and articulated. And von Rundstedt himself, the senior field marshal, dismissed and isolated because he had spoken plainly about military reality. Hitler surrounded himself with men who told him what he wanted to hear and destroyed the men who told him what he needed to hear. The result was a command structure increasingly disconnected from reality, making decisions based on fantasies rather than facts, committed to courses of action that military mathematics showed to be impossible. Meanwhile, the military situation collapsed exactly as von Rundstedt had predicted. Paris fell on August 25, 1944, liberated by French forces with American support. The symbolic significance was enormous. The city that had been the jewel of German conquest, the capital that had symbolized German triumph in 1940, was now lost. The German flag that had flown over the Eiffel Tower for 4 years was lowered. French troops entered the city to scenes of jubilation that contrasted sharply with the German defeat. By September 1944, American and British forces had advanced beyond Paris. The Netherlands, Belgium, and most of France had been liberated. German forces were in retreat across distances that paralleled the distances of their advance 4 years earlier. But the retreat was far more catastrophic than the advance had been triumphant. The Wehrmacht in the West had lost over 400,000 men since D-Day. Killed, wounded, missing, or captured. The equipment losses were staggering. The morale of surviving soldiers was devastated. Germany was being driven back to its own borders by enemies who controlled the sea, the sky, and possessed industrial capacity that dwarfed German production. The bombing campaign intensified. German cities burned. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, and dozens of others were reduced to fields of rubble by waves of American bombers by day and British bombers by night. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died in the firestorms. Industrial production collapsed as factories were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. The transportation network disintegrated as railways, bridges, and roads were systematically destroyed. Germany was being systematically dismantled, while its leadership insisted that victory was still possible, that wonder weapons would change everything, that German superiority would ultimately triumph. On the Eastern Front, the situation was even more catastrophic. Operation Bagration, launched by Soviet forces on June 23, 1944, the same day as Operation Cobra in the West, destroyed German Army Group Center in a defeat that exceeded even Stalingrad in scale. The Soviet offensive was the largest military operation ever conducted, involving over 2 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and approximately 40,000 artillery pieces and mortars. German defenses, already stretched thin, collapsed under the weight of attack. The Soviets advanced over 400 miles in 2 months, reaching the outskirts of Warsaw by August. German forces that had spent years conquering Soviet territory were driven backward in months. Soviet armies that had lost millions of soldiers to German offensives were now inflicting similar casualties on German forces with the added advantage of fighting on terrain where supply lines could be sustained. By January 1945, Soviet forces had reached the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. German military capability had been reduced to managing retreats, fighting delaying actions, attempting to preserve whatever forces remained for a final defense that everyone understood would be futile. Millions died, soldiers and civilians alike, in a war that continued only because one man refused to accept reality and surrounded himself with subordinates too afraid or too loyal to tell him the truth. Remarkably, von Rundstedt's story was not yet over. In September 1944, with Germany facing invasion from both east and west, Hitler recalled von Rundstedt to command. The old field marshal was brought back to the very position he had been dismissed from, Commander-in-Chief West. Why? Because there was no one else. The competent generals were dead, imprisoned, disgraced, or exhausted. The sycophants and true believers had proven incapable of defending Germany. Hitler needed someone with prestige and military experience to hold together a crumbling army, someone whose name still commanded respect among the officer corps, someone who could give orders that soldiers would obey despite their recognition that those orders could not change the outcome. Von Rundstedt accepted, though he had no illusions about what he could accomplish. He was 69 years old, tired, and suffering from heart problems. He told his staff that his job was to preside over a catastrophe, not to prevent one. The war was lost. Everyone except Hitler knew it. But Germany was still fighting, and soldiers were still dying, and someone had to give the orders, even if those orders could not change the outcome. In December 1944, Hitler launched his last great offensive in the West. The attack through the Ardennes, which would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's plan, not von Rundstedt's. The field marshal had opposed it from the beginning. He thought the forces allocated were insufficient for the objectives assigned. He thought the logistical situation made sustained offensive operations impossible. The fuel did not exist to reach Antwerp, the stated objective. The Luftwaffe could not provide sustained air support. The weather prediction on which the attack depended was uncertain at best. Even if the attack broke through, it could not be exploited or sustained. Von Rundstedt proposed what he called the small solution, a more limited attack that might achieve local success without risking everything. Hitler rejected it. The attack would proceed as he had ordered. The offensive went forward on December 16, 1944, with approximately 250,000 German soldiers and 1,400 tanks and assault guns, roughly the last significant operational reserves Germany possessed. It achieved complete tactical surprise. American forces, convinced that Germany no longer possessed the strength to attack on a significant scale, were caught unprepared. The front buckled. A bulge 50 miles deep formed in the American lines. Some American units were overrun. Others fled in panic. For a few days, as German spearheads drove westward toward the Meuse River and beyond toward Antwerp, it seemed that Hitler's gamble might succeed. But von Rundstedt was right about everything that mattered. The offensive ran out of fuel before it reached its objectives. German fuel consumption in the first days of the offensive was approximately 400,000 gallons daily. German fuel production, hampered by bombing of refineries, provided approximately 100,000 gallons daily. German captured fuel from American supplies provided perhaps another 150,000 gallons. The deficit meant that German tanks stood motionless on roads, their fuel tanks empty, easy targets for Allied aircraft once the weather cleared and air operations resumed. The attack that was supposed to drive deep into Belgium and reach Antwerp stalled because it ran out of fuel. American resistance at key points, particularly at Bastogne, delayed the German advance and disrupted the timetable. The town, surrounded by German forces, was supplied by air by American transport aircraft that braved German anti-aircraft fire to deliver supplies and ammunition. The garrison held, denying the Germans the use of critical roads and buying time for American reinforcements to arrive. When the skies cleared after Christmas, Allied air power returned with devastating effect. The bulge began to shrink. German forces that had advanced 60 miles westward began retreating eastward. By late January 1945, the Germans were back where they had started, having lost approximately 100,000 casualties and 800 tanks that could never be replaced. The Ardennes offensive had accomplished nothing except to accelerate Germany's defeat by consuming resources that might have prolonged resistance by a few weeks. The Ardennes was the last gasp of German offensive capability. After it failed, there was nothing left but retreat, defense, and eventual surrender. Von Rundstedt knew this. Every officer with any understanding of military reality knew this. But the war continued anyway because one man would not permit it to end. In March 1945, von Rundstedt was dismissed for the final time. American forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th, crossing the Rhine River intact, the first time an enemy army had crossed the Rhine since Napoleon. It was supposed to be the primary German defensive barrier, the last major obstacle before the heartland of Germany lay open to invasion. The bridge was supposed to be destroyed if enemy forces reached it. But the demolition charges failed. The bridge remained intact. American forces rushed across before German engineers could prepare new demolition attempts. It was a catastrophic breach of the final German defensive position on the Western Front. Hitler needed someone to blame for the failure. Von Rundstedt had nothing to do with the decision to destroy the bridge, nothing to do with the demolition preparations, nothing to do with the failure. But he was the senior commander. He was relieved and replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kessler. Von Rundstedt went home to his family. He was 69 years old, exhausted, and seriously ill. He had served Germany for over half a century. He had commanded armies in 3 wars. He had won great victories and overseen terrible defeats. And in the end, he had been proved right about everything that mattered and punished for being right. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. Hitler was dead, having shot himself in his Berlin bunker on April 30th as Soviet forces closed in on the city. The 1,000-year Reich that Hitler had proclaimed would last 1,000 years had lasted 12 years and 4 months. The war in Europe had killed approximately 40 million people, soldiers and civilians, combatants and bystanders. 6 million Jews had been murdered in the Holocaust, their deaths part of a systematic genocide that represented the ultimate expression of Nazi ideology transformed into industrial murder. Germany itself lay in ruins. Its cities were destroyed. Its population was homeless or displaced. Its future was uncertain. It would be divided between victorious powers. It would be occupied. It would take decades to recover. Everything that von Rundstedt had warned about in July 1944 had come to pass. The continuation of the war had not preserved German territory or German sovereignty. It had resulted in the complete destruction of Germany, the occupation of German soil by foreign armies, the division of the German nation into separate zones of control, the emergence of a new world order in which Germany had no voice. Von Rundstedt was captured by American forces of the 36th Infantry Division on May 1, 1945, at a hospital in Bad Tölz, where he was being treated for a serious leg ailment and heart problems. He was held as a prisoner of war and treated with the courtesy due his rank and age. The Americans were uncertain what to do with him. He was clearly a senior commander who had served Hitler throughout the war. But he was also a traditional military officer who had apparently disagreed with many Nazi policies and had been dismissed twice for speaking too honestly. He had transmitted orders, including the commando order directing that captured Allied commandos be shot rather than treated as prisoners of war, an order whose execution had resulted in the deaths of captured Allied soldiers in violation of the laws of war. But he had also, according to multiple witnesses, attempted to convince Hitler that the war could not be won and should be ended before Germany was completely destroyed. In January 1949, von Rundstedt was charged with war crimes by the British. The primary accusations related to the treatment of prisoners of war and the execution of captured Allied commandos under Hitler's commando order. Von Rundstedt had transmitted this order to units under his command. Allied commandos had been executed as a result. The trial never happened. Von Rundstedt's health deteriorated so severely that he could not appear in court. The British authorities eventually concluded that prosecuting a dying old man would serve no useful purpose. The charges were dropped. Von Rundstedt was released from custody in May 1949. He spent his final years in retirement near Celle, a small town in Lower Saxony in the British occupation zone. He lived quietly with his wife, avoiding public attention, giving occasional interviews to military historians who sought his perspective on the war. He generally refused to discuss the Nazi period or his own role in it. When asked about Hitler, he was dismissive but not apologetic. When asked about the war, he was analytical but rarely reflective. He never wrote memoirs. He never published justifications for his actions. He never sought to explain himself to the public or to posterity. Whether this was due to ill health, to stoic reticence, or to an unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths about his own complicity, no one can say for certain. The question of moral responsibility in war was one that von Rundstedt apparently chose not to address directly. Gerd von Rundstedt died on February 24, 1953, at age 77. He was buried with military honors at Stucken Cemetery in Hanover. Over 2,000 mourners attended, a testament to the respect he had commanded among German military officers. His grave is marked by a simple stone bearing his name, rank, and dates. It says nothing about his service, his victories, his defeats, or his famous words to Keitel. It is as modest and unceremonious as his final years had been. A man who had commanded armies, conquered nations, and reshaped the map of Europe was buried under a simple stone that would tell future visitors nothing of his life or his legacy. The question that historians have debated ever since is what von Rundstedt's story tells us about moral responsibility in war and in organizations more generally. Some argue that von Rundstedt was just another general who served a criminal regime, that his aristocratic contempt for Hitler did not prevent him from serving faithfully, that his skill as a soldier enabled atrocities he never personally ordered, but certainly facilitated. The commando order he transmitted led to the deaths of captured Allied soldiers who should have been protected by the laws of war. The campaigns he commanded in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union killed millions. His professional excellence served a criminal regime. His competence made possible the execution of criminal orders. From this perspective, von Rundstedt's truth-telling about military strategy does not absolve him of responsibility for participation in a criminal system. Others argue that von Rundstedt represented the tragedy of the professional soldier trapped in a criminal system, that he was not a true believer in Nazi ideology, but rather a craftsman who served the state without questioning the purposes of his service. That his famous words to Keitel showed a man who understood the truth but could not act on it except through speech. He was trapped by his own conception of duty, by traditions of obedience that left no room for moral independence, by a lifetime of training that taught him to follow orders rather than to question them. From this perspective, von Rundstedt deserves sympathy as a man who saw the moral catastrophe but lacked the agency or courage to act decisively against it. Perhaps both interpretations contain elements of truth. Perhaps von Rundstedt was simultaneously a skilled professional, a passive enabler of evil, a clear-eyed realist, and a moral failure. Human beings contain contradictions. History does not offer simple categories that accommodate the full complexity of individual lives. What is undeniable is that von Rundstedt saw what was happening more accurately than almost anyone in the German High Command. 25 days after D-Day, he understood that the war was lost beyond any reasonable hope of recovery. He understood that continuing to fight would only increase the destruction. He understood that the only rational course was to seek peace while there was still something left to save. And he was absolutely right. Everything that happened afterward confirmed his judgment to the smallest detail. The Battle of the Bulge was a futile waste of Germany's last reserves. The defense of the Rhine was a delaying action that bought nothing but time for more destruction. The final defense of Berlin was a bloodbath that served no military purpose whatsoever and cost thousands of German soldiers and Soviet soldiers their lives in a battle for a city that was already lost. Every day the war continued after July 1st. 1944 was a day that cost lives, German and Allied alike, without changing the ultimate outcome by 1 degree. The war would end in German defeat. The only variables were how much additional destruction would occur, how many additional millions would die, and how completely Germany would be dismantled before the inevitable conclusion became undeniable. Von Rundstedt saw this clearly. He said so directly. He was dismissed for his honesty. The deeper lesson of his story concerns how organizations fail when they punish truth-telling. Hitler's Germany was a system optimized for self-deception. Good news flowed upward through the chain of command. Bad news was filtered, softened, delayed, or blocked entirely. Officers who reported honestly on unfavorable situations were accused of defeatism and replaced by officers who reported what the leadership wanted to hear. The result was a command structure that grew progressively more disconnected from reality, making decisions based on fantasies rather than facts, committed to courses of action that military mathematics showed to be impossible. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history and throughout human organizations. Corporations that punish managers for honest assessments of problems. Governments that promote officials who agree with established policy and marginalize those who question it. Militaries that silence officers who challenge accepted doctrine. In every case, the short-term comfort of conformity creates long-term catastrophe when reality finally imposes itself. The people at the top of such organizations make decisions based on information that has been optimized for their psychological comfort, rather than for accuracy. They come to believe their own propaganda because everyone around them confirms it. And by the time they realize the truth, when reality becomes impossible to deny, it is too late to change course. The damage has been done. The opportunity for correction has passed. Von Rundstedt's words, "End the war, you idiots," were not merely an assessment of Germany's military situation in July 1944. They were an indictment of a system that had made honest assessment impossible. They were a statement that the men in charge had lost the ability to see what anyone with functioning eyes could see. They were a cry of frustration from a professional who had spent his entire life mastering a demanding craft, only to watch that craft destroyed by amateurs who believed that will could substitute for reality and faith could overcome arithmetic. The fools did not end the war. They continued fighting for 10 more months. They presided over the destruction of their own country. They sent hundreds of thousands of young men to die in battles that could not be won for objectives that could not be achieved. And when it was finally over, when the ruins were still smoking and the dead were still being counted, the survivors asked how it had happened, how a nation of educated people had followed a madman to complete destruction. Part of the answer is that the people who knew the truth, the people who could see clearly, the people who dared to speak honestly, were systematically removed. They were dismissed, arrested, executed, or driven to suicide. The people who replaced them told comfortable lies until there was nothing left to lie about, until the enemy was in the streets and the Reich Chancellery was burning. Von Rundstedt saw the end coming 25 days after D-Day. He said so plainly. He was removed for his honesty. Germany burned for another 10 months because no one in power could bear to hear what he had to say.